Well, welcome everybody, and I'm glad you made it despite the rain, and I know it's also a podcast, so there are others watching. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Branko Milanovic and his new book. There are other books, but this is his brand new one. And I've known Branko, I won't make very long introductions, but just to say that Branko is right now senior scholar at the Luxembourg Income Studies Center and visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center at CUNY. He has all his life resisted just being a world banker or an international bureaucrat, but he has been a world banker. But also he's always remained an academic, an intellectual, a debater, and he's always, when you look at the details of his life, has navigated that not so easy kind of balance between working in a big institution and going back to teach and do some real academic research. And he's, I think, one of the best examples of that. And he's, of course, well known for his work on income distribution from many angles, and that's the topic of today. We're very lucky to have our own colleague Carol Graham with us today, who is the Leo Paswolski Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and also College Park Professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and a Research Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor, ISA. Carol has been leading Brookings in many kind of different positions, heading different departments, is also a real academic, but deeply into policy, as you know. And she is probably one or two or three world leaders in measuring things somewhat differently than in terms of human progress than just GDP numbers or income numbers. Her book, The Pursuit of Happiness Towards an Economy of Well-Being, which was published in 2011, has really become a classic. And we're very, very happy to have Carol with us to give her perspective from her approach, also from her side, to the topic of income distribution. And finally, we've got Eduardo Porter. I really, Eduardo, I'm very grateful to you to have come down from New York, not just one floor across the street. Eduardo writes the economic scene column for the New York Times. Formerly, he was a member of the Times editorial board, where he wrote about business, economics, and other matters. He is a global person, as far as I can tell. He is born in Phoenix, but grew up in the United States, Mexico, and Belgium. He was a correspondent in Tokyo and London. In 1996, he moved to Sao Paulo, Brazil, as editor of America Economia, a business magazine. So many other things, and he's one of those writers who has dealt with this topic and many other topics from a very global perspective, as well as from an American perspective. So I'm really pleased to have you all here. Branko is going to give his overview, and then we'll, I'm sure, have a lively discussion. Branko will take about 10-15 minutes, and usually we don't encourage PowerPoints, so there are no PowerPoints. But you all know his incredible diagram. I don't know whether he said he would kind of, who gained in globalization over time. And you know, I travel with that diagram in my iPad or my computer or to be honest, sometimes just on paper. And wherever I distribute the diagram, for those who haven't seen it, it's like a highlight of the day. So I of course refer to you, Branko, religiously, but I do kind of take the credit of having that diagram with me and showing it to people who are quite floored by it, because in one diagram you have so much information and such interesting information as to who gained and who lost in the period from 1988 to 2005, I think it is, right?
Right, 2011.
2011, okay. Well, that must be there was a first version till 2005?
2008.
2008, okay, that's it. Okay, Branko, we're all ears for you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Kemal. This is a beautiful introduction. I have to thank everybody for coming here on a rainy day. We know that rainy days always cut the audience substantially, but obviously it has not deterred you. So I'm very grateful to all of you. And of course, I am grateful to Carol and Eduardo for having accepted to be commentators. Now, as Kemal mentioned, I actually do face a double challenge. The double challenge is 10 minutes that I have to speak and without diagrams. So it's actually very hard. And I normally speak for an hour with lots of slides. So I have really to adjust very dramatically. So the way that I decided to do it is actually I would give you a very short sort of a synopsis of aperçu of what the book has. And of course, so that you have a little bit of a feeling whether first you want to buy it or not, or what type of things also you would like to discuss. The book is called, as you know, Global Inequality. So my approach throughout the book is to look basically at the world as a whole, as a single entity. Now, it is most dramatically described in the graph that Kemal alluded to, is that graph essentially takes the whole population of the world, obviously from household surveys from all the different countries, 120 approximately, and then looks at them over the period 1988, which actually happens to coincide with essentially the end of communism, really the joining of China, by China of the international markets. Of course, it happened in even early 80s, but by late 80s, China was really participant there. And also it happens to coincide with the time when India, as we know, 1991 was the crisis in India, and India's policies changed. Up to the period of 2008, and even the update to 2011. Now, the interesting part there, and I will skip many other details, which really go into production of this graph, which is in a paper originally, that I did with Christoph Lackner, is that when you line up people in the world from the poorest 1%, let's say, or the poorest 5%, to the richest, this infamous global top 1%, then you actually put it on the vertical axis, you look like how much was the real income gain at each of these percentiles over the period of approximately 25 years, which, as we know, coincides with really what you might call the high globalization era. And then what you notice, of course, is that the poorest people have gained, I think it's about 15 to 20% in real terms, but then the gains become stronger and stronger and stronger, and around the median of the global income distribution, and not only median, but really like 20% of people there, so it's really like 1.5 billion people in the world, the gains have become very substantial and reach on average, 100%, in some cases even more. And then what is interesting, then you have a very sudden drop, and you come to somewhere about the 80th percentile in the world, and the gains become very, very small. 0, 5%, 10%, but they're dramatically less. And then you continue and go all the way to the top 1%, and of course there is no surprise, their gains are very substantial, again, maybe doubling of real income. Well, the interesting part is then you ask the question, so who are these people who were at what I call the point A, which is this large gains in the middle? Who were the people at point B, which is absence of gains? And who are the people at point C, which are, again, large gains? And not surprisingly, although when the first time I did this graph in June 2012, I was, as Kemal said, I was absolutely also floored. I just couldn't believe that what we knew intuitively does come out in the numbers, is people who are at the point A of large gains, although they're relatively poor, are essentially people in resurgent Asia, let's call it like that. Lots of them from China, obviously, not to the top of the income distribution in China, but the middle, then India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. So much that about 90% of people in that group are from Asia. Then you go to the point B that I said so very little real gain, and there you actually look who is there, and you find that about 75% of the people who are there are people from the rich countries, call it the old OECD, and the lower parts of their income distributions. So these are people who actually saw little gain, and the three countries, because of their size, stand out. It's the US, Japan, and Germany. Very little gain in the lower parts of the income distribution. We are talking about single-digit gains in the case of Japan, even negative, and in the case of the US, double-digit but small. I think it was depending on which group, but these are gains between 12 and 18% or 20%. So that, of course, provoked lots of discussion. I don't need to tell you what are all the implications, but there were all the issues. Did globalization benefit Asian middle class to the detriment of the rich world's middle class? You can also ask if globalization continues with China being sort of succeeded afterwards by India or Indonesia or Ethiopia in the future, whether that particular pattern of development in the West will continue, and whether that particular pattern of development is compatible with democracy and democratic institutions and so on. Obviously, the rise of Trump did help actually in the sort of making the graph more popular, so I'm actually grateful for that. And then, of course, the last point is the point C, where actually, not surprisingly, we have the large increase in the incomes of the global top 1%. Although that global top 1% is essentially composed of people from the old rich countries. And just to give you an idea, half of the people in that global top 1% are from the United States. So, or putting it differently, 12% of the richest Americans are the part of the global top 1%, because it's easier to be part of the global top 1% than to be part of the US top 1%. So this is, then you can also raise the issue, like you can see the middle class, if you will, within this graph. The middle class in the US, for example, or in France, or Italy, or Spain, or UK, is being squeezed from two ends. Being squeezed on the one hand from cheaper labor in less developed or poorer countries, people who can basically do the same jobs that they can do for much less money, and being squeezed domestically from their own top 1% or the people who have done very well during globalization. So this is really the first part of the book, and I intentionally opened that book with that particular slide, which I described so beautifully now. And I was actually asked by a friend that could I do the same slide for the period before globalization? Now, the issue there is that the data are really incomparably of lower quality. But if I use François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson's numbers, you can do that. And there what is interesting, you don't find this remarkable sort of sliding scale of gains and losses, not real losses, but really relative sort of losses. But you get really more or less flat line. So in other words, everybody has gained about the same in the period 1960 to 1988. So this is, of course, a dramatic difference now with the period, after the 1960s and up to the globalization today. So this is essentially what is in the first chapter. Since I took so much time, I have to be very sort of quick on the rest. My second chapter deals with inequality within nations. And there is a logic to that, because inequality in the world, global inequality, can be conceptually divided into two parts: inequality within nations and inequality between. In the first case, we speak of inequality within the US, Mexico, China, India, whatever. In the second case, we speak of gaps in income between US and Mexico, or between Morocco and Spain, or between Russia and Armenia. And I'm intentionally using the countries where you have large migration, because you will see that that's one of the stories in that third chapter. So the second chapter is about inequalities within nations. It is a fairly ambitious chapter because I introduce sort of modification or development of the Kuznets curve. I actually believe that we are now going through Kuznets waves. I actually use quite a lot of data, not only from the modern times, which I take it from from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but even from the pre-modern or agricultural societies of the Middle Age Europe, and to show basically that inequality has historically gone in cycles, and that that it was driven by what I call malign and benign forces. I will not now have the time to explain all of them, but benign forces are obviously forces of education, of social legislation, social security, and so on. Malign forces are historically quite well-known forces of war, which generally would lead to the decline of inequality, and epidemics in the history of the basically European countries and North America. So that's actually the chapter about the Kuznets cycles. Now, the interesting part about that is that actually if you believe then in Kuznets cycles, and I try to convince you that you should, is that you can actually argue that the rich countries are now in the second modern era upswing of the Kuznets cycle. Now, the good news about that is that if there is an upswing now, ultimately down the road there should be a downswing too. But of course I'm very careful about that because I do see currently the forces in the US which rather push towards a further increase of inequality. And then the third chapter is a chapter about the differences in mean country incomes. And the interesting part there is that if you look at the historical data, we have had, it's actually, that chapter is kind of, has a cute title, I think. It's called From Karl Marx to Franz Fanon and Back to Marx, with a question mark. Because historically, if you look at the world at around 1850, most of inequality in the world, or a significant chunk, maybe about 50%, was due to inequalities within nations. You can call that class, I mean, very sort of under, quotes, because it's inequality between rich aristocrats and poor peasants or capitalists and workers. And only 50% was due to the differences in the development or income of the countries. Well, you then fast forward to today, you actually have much greater chunk being due to the differences in mean country incomes. Because what happened over the last 150 years, you had rich countries becoming richer and richer, and two very important countries, large countries, India and China, being stagnant or even on a decline. But most recently, within these 25 years, these two countries in particular and others have started catching up. So that the composition of global inequality, if you project it into the future, is changing in a peculiar way and bringing us back to something that existed in 1850. In other words, there is a shrinkage of the population-weighted differences between the countries because of the catch-up of Asia, but there is also the widening of inequalities within nations. So if you were to project that, you could actually see the class element becoming more important in the future, whereas, of course, until, most of the 20th century and until very recently, and still now, it is really the country element which was more important, and hence I used Fanon as a sort of a writer who actually emphasized the difference between poor and rich countries. And just a final note on that, I just saw today, for example, the World Bank has abolished, which I'm very happy to hear, the term developing countries anymore. So they don't exist anymore because I think it makes sense. It is really becoming more and more difficult to figure out the differences. And somebody was quoted as saying, the difference between Malawi and Malaysia is greater than difference between Malaysia and the US. So it really doesn't make sense to put all the countries in the same sort of a bag. Kemal, am I over 10 minutes?
No, but you can go on to 3 minutes.
Okay, I can go, just the last chapter is the chapter that looks at the future of global inequality. And there I use essentially two forces, not to project it, I don't put real numbers, but to give an idea conceptually. One is the force of economic convergence, which would convert, presumably the mean incomes should converge. And the second is the force of the Kuznets cycles. Now, let me just say like a couple of sentences on each of them. On convergence, I think that, if you look at actually large countries in Asia, plus Brazil, and if you look at their growth rate, and even drop China out, in the last 35 years, they have grown faster in every year than the European Union, US, Canada, and Japan combined. So in other words, if you take the growth rates of the rich countries versus the growth rate of the populous, poorer countries, for the last 35 years, the poor populous countries have grown faster. So if you really believe that there is something that would actually now happen to change that dynamic, it's very difficult for me to see what it would be. So I'm actually rather optimistic on the convergence front. However, I'm optimistic with a caveat because we don't know what will happen in Africa, and because of the increase of population in Africa, that could be something which actually might sort of kind of, how should I say, change a little bit our rather optimistic story of the convergence of incomes. That's between the countries. Now, when I come within countries, I really discuss essentially US and China. I'm relatively optimistic on China because I believe there are forces there that would actually push inequality down. And if you look at the official data, China has not had an increase in inequality for the last almost 10 years. We have huge problems with Chinese data, by the way, but that's a separate issue. Then for the US, I'm less optimistic, and actually I see in the short run forces that would push inequality up, and I would just list them. One is the rising share of income from capital, which we know has been happening. And second force is the rising concentration of capital ownership, which is actually quite dramatic because the Gini coefficient, people don't talk about that very much, and I didn't actually study it very much either, but the Gini coefficient of income from capital in particularly all rich countries is about between 85 and 90. So that's something which is almost unbelievable. Particularly everything is concentrated in the hands of very few people. Then the third force is one that actually received some attention, is that assortative mating or homogamy, although recently I've seen that actually papers arguing that that force was much less strong explanatory factor of rising inequality than was originally claimed. But it essentially means that people of similar educational level, income level marry each other, and that increases inequality. Number 4 is an important element which has been recently brought out in a paper by Tony Atkinson and Christoph Lackner, and that's the fact that more and more people nowadays have large incomes both from labor and capital. And that's actually quite striking because nowadays, if you're in the top 1% by labor income, you have 80% chance to be in top decile by capital income. So we are talking about new capitalism where, it's not like you can imagine old capitalism. Capitalists were rich, but they had no labor income, and workers were poor, but they had no capital income. Nowadays, we have top people who have both capital and labor income. And the fifth element is, of course, the importance of money in the political process. Much has been written about that, so I basically only use the results of other people, and I just bring that as another element which makes me pessimistic. So on that rather sort of somber note, and actually I've gone a little bit over my time, I think I would like to finish and obviously to invite, we will now have a discussion. I'm sure some of these questions may be also raised again. Thank you very much for your attention.